You know, a common question that comes up consciously or subconsciously for Christians and non-Christians alike is the question, what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian, or what is a Christian? And many of us, when we seek to answer this question for ourselves and for a friend or for someone who's asking it, whether we're wondering it ourselves or we're being asked it, we may turn toward creedal beliefs. We believe the right things, we believe the same things, or maybe we turn toward production. We turn toward, do you practice, or do you go to church, or do you read your Bible, or do you pray, or whatever else it might be. And the hard thing is, I think that in the culture that we're in today, our faith is often called into question simply by some associations that we might make, right? Whatever political association it might be, our faith can be called into question. Whatever relational association we might have, our faith can immediately be called into question. And people can begin to wonder, is your faith authentic? Well, you think this, or you're friends with this person, or you act like this, and so is your faith really, truly authentic? And so we try to back it up by saying, well, if I believe the right things, or if I do the right things, then that means that my faith is authentic, kind of no matter what. And it leads us to the question of, what does it mean to be a Christian? We have a lot of different definitions for this, but Jesus had a definition that was 2 words. When he called his disciples, he invited them with 2 words by saying, "Follow me." To be a Christian, simply put, means that we are following Jesus. And that's going to look different for a lot of different people and in a lot of different cultures and a lot of different contexts with a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different biology and a lot of different nature and a lot of different nurture. It's going to look different. At its core, to be a Christian means that we are actively and genuinely following Jesus. In fact, the early church didn't call themselves Christians. They called themselves followers of the way. Followers of the way was the language that they used to describe themselves because they recognized this journey that they were on. They continued to follow Jesus even after his life, death, resurrection, and ultimate ascension. Following Jesus, being followers of the way, recognizes that faith is a journey, much like life. It is a journey, it is a path. We might say my Christian walk is a word that we use sometimes, or we use the expression my faith journey to talk about how this requires movement. And along a journey, we get the visualization of maybe a hill or maybe a steep downhill where we can't keep up with how quickly gravity is pulling us down at that point, or we have flat line where we feel like it's just straight and there's nowhere to go, or maybe there are just turns, or maybe it's a steep uphill climb. This is what life is like, and if our life is built up of a life of faith, then that means that that's exactly what faith is going to be like too. Because when Jesus called his disciples and said, "Follow me," their lives did not get easier, they got harder. And sometimes faith can look like that. Jesus brought them to places they would have never been otherwise. Jesus took them into relationship with people they would have never been in relationship otherwise. Some of those people would have been rather difficult to love and to treat well. The Christian life of service and self-sacrifice is daunting and it is exhausting. It's not easy, and it shouldn't be easy. If it's easy, then we are not following, we are not moving. We should be challenged by the move. And it's interesting that I never this this dichotomy until I became a parent, that something can be so uniquely and entirely exhausting and yet so uniquely and entirely fulfilling. That our faith should look just like that. That yes, it's exhausting, and yet I don't want to not be tired from this. Because if I am, then I'm not being so filled and so fulfilled by this life. But if our faith is a journey and we're going to go to some difficult places and we're going to do some difficult things and it's going to come with rough terrain and it's going to come with steep inclines, then we have to be in shape to walk it. We have to be in shape in order to walk it. And so what we're going to examine over the next few weeks is how can we stay in shape? to practice our faith, to go on this walk, to follow Jesus. If Jesus is going to lead us into all sorts of different places, and we want to be able to say yes, we are going to have to be in a position physically, emotionally, and mentally to be able to say yes. Which means it's going to take some work on our part to put ourselves in that kind of a position, but Jesus leaves the invitation open to us. So how can we go on this journey, and how can we stay in shape? Well, the United Methodist Church, when it comes to the membership, we have membership vows that we take, and this is how we say you're going to go about following Jesus, that we follow Jesus by supporting the church through our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, and our witness. This is what we ask someone when they want to become a member of the United Methodist Church. Not just this one, but all of the United Methodist churches. Will you support the church with your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness? And those are all right, and I think that those are all true, but over the course of the next few weeks, we're kind of just taking those and translating them into stuff that's a little bit less churchy. You know what I mean? So instead of your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness, we are going to be talking about the essential practices for Christian living that are worship and prayer, studying, serving, giving, and sharing. That's what we'll do over the next handful of weeks. And today we begin with worship, because among that list, everything below prayer, everything after prayer or after worship is an act of worship. Prayer is an act of worship. Studying is an act of worship. Serving is an act of worship. Sharing our faith and giving is an act of worship. You get it? So it's the central act of our faith, because everything that we do in faith is indeed an act of worship. Which can beg the question, what is worship? If we think about it as a church building or a place or a space just like this one, and this is worship, I don't think you're wrong. We're just not all-encompassing what worship is. If we look to the dictionary definition, it's going to say something to show reverence to something. But if we look at the Bible, we look at how worship is translated in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Old Testament Hebrew, it uses the word shakah, and shakah simply means to bow or to worship. And in the New Testament, the Greek language is proskuneo, and this means to kiss the ground. And some scholars think this word can actually be used, and culturally was used to describe what it was like when a dog's owner would come home. This is this act of to bow or kiss the ground or to recognize one's master and act appropriately. My dog, Wendy, is getting up there in years, and it's hard to see her age. She's our best little buddy, and she's been the best little companion we could have asked for. But when my wife and I lived in St. Louis, we fostered dogs consistently and all the time, and knew living in a smaller apartment when we first got married that if we found the right dog that was probably smaller and was a little bit lazy, then we might be able to keep. We want to keep a dog, but we just don't. We didn't have a yard. We lived in an apartment, and so Wendy came into our lives, and she's not only a typical Chihuahua who's just nervous about everything. She also had probably a pretty tough background coming in off the streets, and so we don't know what happened to her. But it took her a long time to feel comfortable and safe, and to warm up to us. And there's a famous story in our house that one day I came home from work, and she'd been with us for several weeks at this point, and I was getting tired of her, of her being timid and not doing dog things, right? Well, she doesn't do very many dog things as it is, but there's some that I just needed to happen. And so I got home, and I scooped her up, and I picked her up, and I looked her right in the face, and I said, "You could live here forever, and we can adopt you and bring you home, but I need you to start being excited when I get home. Like, come see me and get and be happy that I'm home, because I'm not feeling that yet, and that's bare minimum dog activity that I need from you." And the story goes, I can't tell you exactly, but my wife is nodding her head. The story goes that it was like the next day she did. The next day she started doing that, and it was a sign, I guess, that she wanted to stay with us. And if you have a dog that behaves like this, now, of course, she's getting a little bit older, and she's like still on our bed, and she's like, "I'm back here." But she cemented herself enough in our family that I guess she reserves the right to do that. We've also added 2 children into her life, which is particularly stressful. But if you have a dog, you know how this goes. You go out to the yard to turn off the hose or whatever, and you come back in and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here. You came back, I'm so glad. And it's the best. This is the picture of proskuneo, of worship in the New Testament. How often does our worship look like this? When we come to worship, we say, oh Jesus, I'm so glad you're here. I get to be with you. I know that I was just with you 5 minutes ago in Sunday school, but I'm so glad I get to worship you again. And you're going to be here. That's amazing. I don't know if this is exactly the picture that the Greek writers had in mind, but I think it's a fair comparison that when we say to kiss the ground, to bow, it's not just with reverence. Can it also be with pure joy and love and excitement? Because when we do any act of the Christian life, we are acting in worship. We are bowing down to our Creator who made us and who loves us and who is worthy. Worship is any time that we give God our devotion, and we are shaped into the image of what we worship. Because oftentimes when we think about worship, we think about it in the sense of whether or not we will worship. Because worship is really reserved for when we're talking about religion or a deity. Or if we say that somebody worships something and it's not based in religion, then it's usually kind of tongue-in-cheek, right? Like they really worship that, or they worship their spouse, or we don't really think about it that way. And so we don't think we worship anything else unless we're involved in some sort of religious practice. But that's not at all true. The question is not whether or not we will worship. The question is, what will we worship? We were hardwired for worship. We were created for gratitude. We were created for response. We will worship something. At any given moment, nearly, our lives will be built around the worship of something. And so the question is not whether or not we will engage in worship. The question is, what will we worship? Because we become what we behold. We become what we behold. And if we say worship, we should be referencing the idea that I am worshiping a God in whose image I'm made and yet need to grow more into. We have a different word when we worship something that is not worthy of our worship, and that word is idolatry. Any sin that exists is based in idolatry. We are placing something in the wrong seat. And worship rewires us to place the proper one in his proper throne. Worship rewires us for that, and yet there are a million options out there for what we can worship. And Jesus even echoes this in Luke 4 when he quotes the Old Testament. He says, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." That's a necessary commandment because there are plenty of alternatives to worship. There are plenty of alternatives to serve. And yet Jesus says, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. See, I make worship a priority in my life because if I don't, something else will become that priority. And here's the conflicting problem. I have plenty of other things as a pastor who literally, this is my job. I have plenty of other things in my life that I worship that aren't God. Plenty. And yet, if I don't make worship a priority, imagine how many more things I would place on the throne of God that aren't really God. Imagine how many more things I would fill in there for myself that serve me and me only. I make worship a priority because if I don't, I will choose something else of less significance to worship instead. It's because of my worship of God that I'm able to see the other thing that I worship and say, that's not good. I may do that, but I don't want to do that. And worship resets me to be able to focus on the one who is worthy of my worship. God's a priority for me. And this is why we worship in the morning traditionally. If you remember, the women who visited the tomb got up first thing in the morning, and what was the first thing on their mind? I got to go take care of Jesus. Got to go take care of Jesus. So they went early in the morning while it was still dark. They went to the tomb. And of course, we know they found the empty tomb. And that's where the tradition of worshiping in the morning is. Do we think about our need for worship and our relationship with God when we first wake up in the morning? My first thought when I wake up in the morning is getting my family the heck out of the house in the middle of the chaos. That's usually my first thought. But it shouldn't be. And so I try to do what I can to get up before the chaos begins in an effort to switch around my priorities, because then the chaos looks different and I behave differently in the middle of it. It doesn't mean that not worshiping in the morning or worshiping in the evening or doing what we do is wrong. It just means that that's where that tradition comes from. The way we live our lives is a reflection of what we worship or who we worship. And this is also why we worship together. Because if this is this important to us, we want to share in our celebration. We want to share in our love, and we want to share in our hope when we recognize that the people around us have something to offer us as well, because God has blessed them in this way. I want to learn from them. God made us needing connection. It's a way that we are made in the image of God, because this is the image of God, requiring and needing connection. Remember who God is? God is 3 in 1. God is a God of relationship, not a God of isolation. And if we are made in that image, we are hardwired for relationship. Every 6 days is a recharge, according to the Bible. Is how we are made. God is always others focused. In a life lived in isolation, worship only happening by myself is a life and a worship of isolation, which is not a reflection of who God is. God is always others focused. God is triune in nature. And then when Jesus comes to earth, A, to be with us, and B, what is the first thing Jesus does when he begins his ministry? I'm going to surround myself with friends. Immediately puts himself in a relationship in order to live the life that God had called him to live. People form and people shape us. We need one another to worship well. I think I've said this quote before, but I'm going to say it every time it's appropriate to put in a sermon. It comes from a pastor by the name of Tony Evans. And Tony Evans says this about church. He says, I hear people say you don't have to go to church to be a Christian. And they are absolutely right. Salvation is through faith alone and Christ alone. But you don't have to go home to be married. But stay away long enough and your relationship will be affected. You don't have to go home to be married, but stay away long enough and your relationship will be affected. We need one another to walk this walk. If it's a difficult journey, it's much easier to do it with others. This is what we are for. This is what the person to your left and to your right and behind you and in front of you is for, to walk this journey together. This is how Jesus did it. This is the life that Jesus lived. And yet, Jesus lived this rhythmic lifestyle where he would go and he would be with others and he would do ministry and he would teach and he would heal and he would serve. And then after that, he would retreat, and he would go, and he would be himself. That life requires both togetherness and solitude. Here it is in Mark chapter 1, the very beginning. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. There's a difference between solitude and isolation. We can have solitude without isolation. We're not intending to be isolated, but there will be moments in which we need solitude. Life guarantees at some point we're going to be alone. There will be points where we will be alone, whether we live alone or whether we are traveling for whatever purpose on our bike or in our car or we're going for a walk or we are in the shower or whatever, we will be alone at some point. And if our whole life is supposed to be an act of worship, then it must mean I have to worship when I'm alone too. That even though we need each other for worship, we also must worship when we are alone. So then what does worship look like as an individual? Worship in solitude, at its core, is prayer. prayer is worship on our own. We are communing with the triune God when we pray. We'll talk more about prayer in class if you're coming on Wednesdays. And we'll talk more deeply about this idea. But I think prayer is a deeply misunderstood issue within our church with Christians. And so where can we start with prayer? If we make worship, you all are here. So you've got something down that you are worshiping corporately, communally with others. You see value in doing what we're doing right now. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. And yet sometimes we go off and we're by ourselves, and now we think, well, the songs aren't on the screen. We're not being led to the call to worship. I don't know what scripture to read. I don't know. There's not a pastor to teach or preach. So where do I go from here? And so we think, well, I ought to pray, but how can I pray? I'm not really sure what to do. Here's a helpful tip for you. Author Anne Lamott attests that ultimately there are only 3 prayers anybody will ever need to pray, and they're all one word each. Help, thanks, and wow. Help, thanks, and wow. Now, I would recommend for the sake of your relationship that those prayers would go longer than that to actually commune with God, but as a baseline stance, when we can think about our prayer, we can ask ourselves the question, do I need a prayer of help, a prayer of thanks, or a prayer of wow? And now there might be times when we need all 3 of them, or 2 of them, or whatever, but this might be a helpful framework for you to say, do I need help? And what do I need help with? Let me pray about that. What am I feeling grateful for? How can I give God thanks and praise today? And where has God just left me in awe? Where I can say, wow. Help, thanks, and wow. This might not be our entire prayer, but it can be a launching point for us in our prayer life. And in order to help us do this, Adam Hamilton, who is a pastor, a United Methodist pastor in the Kansas City area, wrote the book called The Walk, which we're doing the study off of, and he helps us with a couple of reminders. We've talked today about worship, prayer, and he wants to use our hands to help us remember this. Together, we need to be together. Our hand comes together. We need to worship corporately with one another, but we also will be by ourselves, and we need to worship when we are by ourselves as well. And we can use an open hand to remind us, see, our fingers are together, and our fingers are alone. This reminds us to pray. But not only that, these 5 things, these 5 fingers can remind us of when to pray and where to start. If we can pray when we wake up, when we eat breakfast, when we have lunch, when we have dinner, before we go to bed, we're making strides in our prayer life, because prayer then becomes a regular practice for us. It's not enough to just do it whenever we are a last-ditch effort and really need some help. It has to be a consistent practice for us, because our whole life should be built up in worship. And if individual worship is prayer, then prayer must be a regular part of our schedule, and our hands can remind us to do that. When we see a closed fist, we can remember, I need others. We need to worship together, but I also need to worship on my own, and I can do that at the very least 5 times a day, when I wake up, when I eat my meals, and when I go to sleep. This is what we need. This is how we worship. This is what a life of worship looks like, and it's the foundation for us to be able to do things that we want to do with our lives. We need one another. We also need to worship in the times when we are alone, and we need solitude, we need encouragement from God. Let's do that over the course of these weeks as we walk together, worship and prayer to be the absolute center of our attention, and everything in our lives will flow out of what we worship, and may that thing we worship be the Most High God. And at this table,